Been thinking about a vacation trip to the Pacific Northwest? Well, those are just a few of the sounds of this big country. And at Pacific Northwest Bell, we think sounds are about the best way of communicating there is. So we've assembled a collection of typical sounds of the Pacific Northwest. Now sit back and listen. Then
Hey everybody, Kimbo back with part 2 of my 3-part series on Seattle Pacific Northwest bands. Part 2 here is going to be on the grunge years, 85 to roughly 92, 93, and then stay tuned for part 3, which is going to be the post-grunge years to present. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you later. One of the first forefathers of the grunge era was this Deep Six album that, as you can see, had River with Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard of Pearl Jam, Mother Love Bone, Malfunction that had Andrew Wood, the Mother Love Bone singer, of course, the Melvins, who I'll talk about them in a minute, early pioneers in the grunge scene, Skin Yard, Soundgarden, and the U-Men that I just talked about here. This came out early 86. So what's considered, well, it's actually the first recordings of Soundgarden that were put to vinyl. And let's see. Yeah, so one of the very first grunge albums that were put out, actually this probably the second or third. There's, well, I'll talk about the next one here is the Melvins. The Melvins, who are out of originally Montesano, moved around between Montesano in the early days, Montesano and Aberdeen. And they, but after they put out a couple records, I think this one came out March 80, not this one, their first EP. I don't have their first EP, but their first EP came out March of 86. And in about 87, 88, they moved down to San Francisco and eventually moved down to LA out of the area. But this is Houdini, which is their first major label release on Atlantic, I believe, which is about their 4th or 5th album. But their first EP came out in March of 86. Their first EP came out right about the same time as this. I'll do that one. So, Tad Doyle, definitely a grunge band, early signer on the Sub Pop label that started in the Seattle area here by Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Pullman about 1988-ish. Some really hardcore grunge with Tad. Takes a little getting used to, but kind of a mainstay in the Seattle area grunge scene. Okay, moving on to another early signer on the Sub Pop label was Soundgarden. In fact, I think Bruce Pavitt and Chris Cornell were pretty good friends. Soundgarden, whose first EP here, Screaming Life, 1987, this Screaming Life EP came out, and then followed up by the FOP EP, and well, I'll just show this one here, Flower. I like this one because it's still got Hero. Hero left the band after their first major release, which I'm going to show here. He went on to pursue his physics degree. Just after they put out this record right here, the Ultra Mega OK. Now, at this time, they were being courted by major labels, but they decided to release something on SST. So their first album here is recorded on the SST label, or put out on SST. And then that was followed up by, Louder Than Love, and then that one, Down on the Upside. That's what I have for Soundgarden. So moving on to the next band, really credited with the innovators of grunge, and that's Green River, of course, contained Mark Arm as their front man, who later would go on to form Mudhoney, and Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard, who would later go on to form Mother Love Bone and then Pearl Jam. This Green River album came out in the fall of 1985, considered by most to be the first grunge record. So this came out fall of 85. This came out spring of 86, and of course the Melvins' first album, spring of 86. But this came out in fall of 85, so considered the first grunge record, put out on the Homestead label. I believe Homestead's out of New York. But then later would sign with Sub Pop and put out this album here, Dry as a Bone, here. And then by the time they had recorded this album here, why can't I remember the name of it here? Rehab Doll, sorry, on Sub Pop Records. By the time they'd had this recorded and then eventually released, the band had artistic differences. Stone and Jeff wanted to pursue more of a commercial and court major labels and go a little bit more of the commercial route, where Mark Arm, the singer, wanted to, kind of stay independent, do his own thing, and have freedom with doing that. So this came out in 1990. 89 or 90. They'd split up, and Jeff and Stone had already started working with other people to start pulling together music for the Mother Love Bone. And so before I get into that, so we'll talk about a little bit about Mudhoney. After the breakup of Green River, 1988, Mark Arm formed Mudhoney, and this is their first EP they released in 1988, Super Fuzz Big Muff, which is on the Sub Pop label, and great record. They re-released this later as a double and threw in some other songs that I don't think are as good. I think if you want to get this, try and get the original. These, 5 or 6 songs are just, every one of them is fantastic. To me, this is pretty much the greatest grunge album to ever come out right here. Love this album. One of my favorites I used to crank this all the time back in the early days. There's another Mudhoney. Okay, and then, so moving on to Mother Love Bone. After the breakup of Green River, as I mentioned, Jeff and Stone started putting music together. They got Andrew Wood to come and sing. They put out this EP, Shine, in 1989. There's the back. And then followed that up, got a contract with Polydor Records, and started putting together this record here, Apple. This was due to be released late March of 1990. But 2 weeks before this release, Andrew Wood died of a heroin overdose. So they pushed the release out to July of 1990. But great record. Fantastic stuff from those guys. So let's see. So then in the fall of 1990, they started recording this album, which included Chris Cornell and Mike McCready, who was later in Pearl Jam. Andy and Chris were roommates for a year or two, I should say. And they describe it as Andy would be in one room with his keyboard and Chris would be with his guitar in another room, and they would just write songs all day. So Chris and Andrew were real good friends, roommates, and after he passed, Chris wrote a bunch of songs as a tribute to Andrew, and he asked the guys, the ex-Mother Love Bone guys, if they wanted to put together a record. So they recorded this in the fall of 1990, and then released it in April 1991. Yeah, April 2nd. Okay, which leads us to Pearl Jam. So as I mentioned, Jeff and Stone Gossard got with Mike McCready. They started laying down some tracks early on in 1990, but they didn't have a singer. They had done some work with the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Jack Irons, and Jack said, "Oh, I kind of got a guy in mind down here in the LA area that is a good singer. Why don't you send me a tape?" So they sent a tape down to Eddie Vedder. He laid some vocals on about 3 songs and sent them back, and these guys were just floored on what they heard, and they sent them up here immediately started recording. And let's see, went in and recorded this of March. They got together and recorded this in March of 1991, and then released in March of 1991, and then just took off from there. Of course, Pearl Jam, and then I'm going to show one other. This is their self-titled, or sometimes called Avocado. Underrated album in my book. I love this album. The last song, Inside Job, is probably my number 6 favorite Pearl Jam song. Inside Job. Great song. Okay, another grunge band around that same time frame, a little bit before Pearl Jam, is Alice in Chains. 1990, their first album, Facelift, is released. This is their second album from 1992. Let's see, I have this live one here. Probably not worth showing. Okay, next band. If you go down to Olympia and make a right and drive for 45 minutes in Aberdeen, Washington. So in 1987, this band here, Chris Novoselic and Kurt Cobain, of course, formed Nirvana there. They went through a few different drummers at first before, of course, they settled on Dave Grohl to be their drummer. But on this album here, I believe when they came up and did these demos up in Seattle with Jack and Dino, I believe the Melvins drummer did a lot of the work on this. This is their first EP that was released in 1989. And then, of course, became really big with the Nevermind release in 1991. And then followed that up with In Utero. Okay, let's see. So, well, all this grunge silliness was going on over in the Seattle area, about 2 hours east of here, over the mountains. There was another band that was about the same time frame, formed in 1985, put out their first album in 86. This is their 1987 release, especially, even if and especially when, put out in 1987. They got lumped in a lot with all the grunge bands that came out of Seattle, but these guys are actually kind of more of a psych alternative rock band. Really good stuff. One of my favorites to kind of come out of this whole era. If you ever get a chance, if you haven't checked out Screaming Trees, really good stuff. And then this was their next one. The Invisible Lantern. And there's another one, Other Worlds. These guys broke up about 2000, and their frontman and singer, Mark Lanigan, continued to put out records. I think he put out his first one in 2001. I believe this is the 2015 release. He also had a release last year, which I don't have yet, but I want to pick up. But he, kind of similar type music, kind of psych rock stuff that he does. So thanks for tuning in. That kind of ends part 2 for the grunge years. Stay tuned tomorrow or the next day, somewhere around there. I want to get around to editing it for part 3, the post-grunge years. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you later.